In this tutorial, we're going to migrate the advanced social system into your own project. So you see here we have a sample project, which is just your basic third-person project with a character and a game mode. And we assume that you've already migrated the content folder from the advanced social system. So if you look at the blueprints here, there's a social player controller. If your project does not have a player controller, you can skip a fair chunk of the migration by simply using the social player controller, and you can rename it to whatever you want to match your project. But to make this merge tutorial a little bit more interesting, we're going to create a brand new player controller called your player controller, and then I will go through the steps to migrate it if you have an existing player controller. If you go into your game mode, and make sure that the player controller class is set to your player controller. And now a quick overview of some of the blueprints. So the social player state and the social game state are very important for networking. The social player state is replicated to all the players from the server, and it holds information about your player, such as the social ID, guild name, party ID. If you already have a player state, you want to make sure that you add these variables, make sure they're replicated, and their default values are set. And if you go into the social game state, this is where the server holds the information about the players, the guilds, and the parties. And you see here on the event graph, we go through and we load the demo content from the data tables to simulate loading from a database. If you want to hook up a database to read players and guild information, this is the place where you want to do it. And you see here we have some functions that the server uses to create and edit parties and guilds. The social game mode is very similar to the regular game mode that you may have. We'll migrate it though. So we're going to move the social player state and the social game state because we don't have one in our project. So let's just rename it to your player state. And your game state. If you do have these in your project already, the migration steps will be very similar to what we do with the character and the player controller. You'll just have to update a couple cast nodes in the social component. And in the social folder, we have all the classes and the component for the social system. The social controller interface is what gets assigned to the player controller to interact with the social component. I will go over the social component in greater detail in another video, explaining how to create your own commands and add new emotes. So let's go ahead and move the rest of the blueprints that we want to migrate. And we'll leave the social game mode, social player controller, and social player character as we'll migrate these manually. If you see an error when copying the social folder, just click OK and continue. You can see here that you get a warning about the social player controller. So if we go into the social system component, compile and save it, that should clear up any issues. And then into the social player controller and do the same. Okay, now we're going to migrate the changes to the player controller. So if we open up your player controller, which is just an empty player controller, we want to add a social system component. Compile and save. Then in the class settings, we want to add the social controller interface. And again, compile and save. And you can see it gave us two new interface functions here. So if you go into get social component, simply drag the social component and plug it in, compile. We'll just go into the social player controller and cut and paste the logic here. And what this does is it's basically saying to return from your player state the different variables that you have stored so that the UI can get this information easily. So if you make any changes or want to replicate different variables for your player, you would want to add that into your player state, and then this is one of the areas where you need to update it to return that information. So next we need to add a variable for the HUD reference, which is a chat HUD layout, and then a bool for is right mouse button down. So we'll go ahead and add those variables. Let's add one here called HUD layout. Search for the chat HUD layout. And if you have your own HUD layout already with UMG, you can simply just import the 3 widgets into it. Okay, now that we have the variables set up, we need a load player info function. And if you see here, instead of a begin play, we have a client load player. And what it does is it creates the HUD, saves a reference, initializes the social system by passing in those 3 UI widgets that are in our HUD, and then we call the server load player event with a player ID of -1. What this does is it loads the load player info function. In this function, if you pass in -1, it will load each player in order from your players list. Or if you pass in a player ID, it will go through the game state, get the information about the players, and set your player state variables with your information. So we can go ahead and copy all of this, and we just need to make sure that we create the local variable, local player ID, and put the input player ID. So we'll add that player ID integer in the inputs, and we'll go create the local player ID. Through this migration step, if you name the variables the same, it really makes it a lot easier. So we'll just hook these back up. We can compile and save it. Now we just need to migrate the rest of the event graph. So we'll start off by grabbing the inputs and the social UI events for the interface. Now you see here when I compile, we get an error for HUD reference. It's because I accidentally named it HUD layout earlier, but we can just simply update the name, click compile, and the error goes away. Okay, so next we can select the initialization code here, copy it, and paste it. And one thing to note when pasting events, it recreates it on paste. So you see here at the end, we're not calling the server load player, so we just have to add that back in. And make sure to assign -1 if you want it to load each player that joins in order. Compile and save. And that's it. The player controller has been migrated. So pretty straightforward, pretty easy. I'll just save all here. Now we're going to migrate the game mode. So we'll just open up our game mode and minimize it. And then we'll go into the social game mode. And you see here that delayed start is checked. We have a ready to start match function overridden and an event. So we'll just update it with delayed start. We'll add your player state and your game state that we migrated over earlier and renamed. Compile and save. And if we open the full blueprint, let's go ahead and override the ready to start match function. We can simply copy and paste this. And what this is doing here is in your game state, after it loads the guilds and player info, it sets this flag to true. And so we could copy the event here, except we have to recreate it. So we'll just copy the comment, override the event, paste the comment. And we'll pull off and cast to your player controller. And then we'll get the event for client load player. And depending on how your game's set up, you may or may not want this approach. You may be fine with just using onBeginPlay and not having the delayed start. But what this does is help it wait for the server to finish loading the guilds and the player info before it loads in the players. Next, we'll work on migrating the character. So we need to add a nameplate widget. The event begin play is what sets up the widget. We have a couple server events here for stopping montage, and play sound. And then in our basic input here, we have a branch saying if we're moving, we want to stop playing a montage. And also we only want to rotate with the mouse if we're holding down right mouse button. So if we look at the nameplate widget, it's a user widget component. It's set 100 centimeters above the player, space screen, player nameplate, draw size 00, and tick when off screen is checked. So if we go into your character, let's add a new widget component. And we'll call it nameplate widget. Just quickly set it up here. So we'll move it 100 above the player. Set its space to screen. We'll pick the player nameplate widget class. Draw size, set it to 0. And tick when off screen. Compile and save. Now if we look at the event graph, this is the basic third-person project template. So let's just get rid of this gamepad and on-touch input and move things around a bit here. So now if we look at the social player character event graph, we could pretty much just go back to cut and pasting. So let's cut the on event begin play. We'll paste it in. And because our nameplate widget's the same, we can just compile and save. Then we want to copy the events, paste those in as well. And again, because we're pasting in an event, it's recreating it, so we have to call the multiplay montage again. And now we can just copy the branch and the server stop montage. Let's quickly hook this up. It's just for in the demo, so if you start dancing and then you move, it stops the dancing, so it doesn't look funny. And then here with player controller, we're going to have to recreate this. Let's make a bit more room. We'll get controller. And we'll cast it to your player controller. We'll get is right mouse button down. And if you hold B and left click, you can drop a branch. Now we can just cut and paste that and hook it up. Okay, so we can close these. That's everything with the character migrated. Just hit save all. Okay, so now we just need to update the character reference in the social system component. So if we just search cast a social player, we should see it here in the show emote actions function. So we'll just pull off get control pawn and cast to your character. Because we have these events created now, we can get multiplay sound. We want to hook in local sound. And then we want to get multiplay montage. And we'll hook in the local montage. And we can remove the old stuff. Compile and save. And we can go ahead and close the social system component. Now let's just give it a quick test. So you may notice that you don't see any UI. In the third-person project, we've got a character that we possess in the world when we want to spawn in the player. So if we delete that, and we click play again, everything's working. So the system's migrated over. We'll work on cleaning up the few remaining directories, and I'll go over a bit about animations in the next part here. Let's right-click on the content folder and fix up redirectors. You might get a warning, that's okay. We'll just save all. And we'll close it down and reopen. Make sure we don't have any errors. Okay, now if we take a look at the animations, the social system comes with a few emotes and the bare minimum of third-person animations. So you see that the emotes are actually montages. That's what the system plays when it uses the emotes. First, I want to make a note. If you're using a third-person project and you created it before 4.11, you're going to have an issue with the basic animations. If you take a look here, you see that the root bone's rotated forward. And this will cause issues with your animations blending. You might see dips or other issues. If you look at the idle animation in the social system, you see the correct bone structure. So I'm not going to go over fixing that. Again, it's fixed in 4.11, but just so you're aware. Now if you look in the third-person anim blueprint, in the anim graph, we simply have the default state machine into the final pose. So in order to blend the emote montages, we need to actually set up a blend system. So if you look at the social system third-person anim blueprint, you see that we cache the locomotion pose. We blend per bone at spine 01 for the upper slot, which then feeds into a default slot into the final pose. This lets us play a montage while you're running or moving. So we're just going to migrate over the two animations here for the emotes. So if you click Show Only Compatible Skeletons and select the other mannequin skeleton for your project, this will create a migrated copy of the animations. It places it in the same folder as your skeleton is. So if you go into Character Mesh, you see that they're created here. So let's move them into the animations folder. And now we need to set up the montage blending. So let's pull off the default state machine and create a new cache pose. We'll call it locomotion. Compile and save. Now let's get the used cache pose locomotion. We'll get a second copy of it. And if we pull off and get default slot, then let's pull off and blend per bone. Let's plug that in. And let's create the new filter for spine_01. Now if we pull off the layered blend, get default slot again, plug that into the final pose. Then we need to go in and create another slot, so we'll call it upper slot. And save it. Compile. And then we need to assign this to use the upper slot, and compile and save again. Okay, now the blend is set up. So we'll just rename the animations. And then right click, create anim montage. If we go into it, we can see it's using the default slot, and the default slot will overwrite all of your animation with the montage. And if we do the same with the laugh emote, you see that the emote's only really playing from the spine up. So if we change the slot to upper slot, then when you're walking and you play the laugh animation, your legs will keep moving, but it'll override the animation from your spine one up. Now let's go into the social emotes list and just update the emotes to use the new animation. You can see here now they're at game, your project. So we'll do that for the laugh. And save and close this. Now let's move over the sounds for the laugh into your project. Let's quickly test. Okay, so you see the dip there? That's because your project has the broken animations that Epic provides with the third-person project. Again, these will be fixed in 4.11. So now we can move over the UI folder to your project, and if you want to move over the map, just move that over. And if you do move over the map, you should migrate the materials. And the meshes. But because we already have a meshes folder with this exact mesh in our project here, we're just going to delete the one from the social system and replace the reference with the ones from your project. Save it, and then you can see it cleans it up there. So now all we should have is those 3 blueprints that we've migrated manually. We'll fix up redirectors on the content folder one more time, and we'll save and close. Then we'll open it up to make sure there's no issues. Let's give it a quick playtest. We'll try with 2 players here. Okay, it seems to be working fine. The emotes are playing over the network. So save all, fix up redirectors one last time just for good habit. We'll close it down. Now let's delete the saved and intermediate folders, and if you go into the content folder, we can delete the advanced social system folder. Now when we relaunch, we should have a fully migrated and clean project. There are no errors. Thank you for watching, and if you have any questions or issues with your migration, please send us an email or add us on Skype.